So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Hameleers, and today I would like to present a project on disinformation, not just as false information as a conceptual phenomenon on the supply side of information, but also as a perception of information credibility with their impact on trust and how this is perceived in a post-truth world. So first of all, to set the stage and to offer context for this topic, we live in a context where trust in the media is steadily declining across countries, and when distrust across the nations is higher than the level of trust people have in the news. We also live in a time where mis and disinformation, either unintentionally false information or intentionally deceptive information, are spread across social media at a very high rate. However, we also live in a setting where factual ideas and expert knowledge and objective truthfulness is subject to increasing doubt, skepticism, and also related to accusations of being false. So we see this a lot in line with the success of populist movements, that mis and disinformation are not just used to describe false information, but also strategically used as labels to delegitimize established knowledge and politics and society, with real effects on the trust people have in the news and information that is coming from conventional sources. So this context where mis and disinformation are more than just false information, but also perceptions and accusations, is really important to take into account to understand the comprehensive effect of mis and disinformation on society. So also important to take into account here is that although we talk a lot about the threats associated with disinformation and fake news, it's a very unfrequent phenomenon in reality. The estimates may differ from each other, but based on a recent meta-analysis, it has been found that disinformation across different markets makes up only less than 1% of people's actual media diet. Even if this is a higher percentage, it's still the large minority of information is false, which also means that a large majority of information is based on an accurate understanding of reality. However, this impression of public reality and concerns about disinformation tends to overestimate and tries to inflate the concerns with disinformation and makes it bigger than actually is. We really see that the media and educators, but also politicians, clearly sound an alarm that we have to be very worried about disinformation and misinformation, about deepfakes in particular, whereas in reality, backed by empirical evidence, we find that disinformation, and especially deepfakes that have been surrounded by a lot of concerns, are less prominent and less dominant than the public thinks they are. This idea of disinformation being very much present and disinformation, deepfakes being all around, may also be misused and exploited by malign actors and malicious politicians that try to use this context of distrust, try to use this setting where people believe that disinformation is all around, to blame inconvenient truths and oppose political actors for spreading fake news. But it can also be really misused to cultivate distrust. And this whole contextual understanding of disinformation, in my opinion, in my research, has also an impact of how we perceive and understand trust in today's post-truth society. So from a more conceptual level, I think it's important that we see mis and disinformation not just as an informational crisis of false information, but also really focus on discursive elements of the accusation of mis and disinformation, but also perceptual issues related to perceiving that mis and disinformation are around. So as a genre, as sort of the informational crisis, we can see mis and disinformation as the malign deceptive information campaigns orchestrated by foreign countries or domestic nations, or unintentional errors in news coverage. Also understood that misinformation or honest mistakes, not necessarily driven by political agenda. On discursive levels, we have the fake news labels and related accusations and delegitimization content to political actors, to established media, to really say, well, the media are an enemy of the people, they deliberately mislead us, something that has become more prominent in line with the rise of populist movements throughout the globe. But here I really like to focus on the consequences of the perceptual component of disinformation, or the widespread belief that information surrounding us today is false and or fake at a higher rate than the presence of false information in society. But what are the drivers of these beliefs? First of all, an important context to take into account is that we currently live in a high choice information setting where people have an abundance of truth claims to select from. Even on the same events, there may be multiple alternative factual interpretations, multiple facts that are presented as objective and based on expert knowledge that compete for attention and legitimacy. So this creates a setting where people can become very confused about which versions of reality to believe in and select, but also makes people more likely to select a version of truthfulness that best resonates with their prior beliefs. In online settings, we also see that alternative narrative and conspiracies get a platform and also a community where people with like-minded views and similar perceptions of distrust in established order can come together and share their opposition to established versions of reality. So in that sense, distrust in this age of social media is becoming platform and community-based, where the delegitimizing narratives are very prevalent on social media. Also in terms of fake news labels and conspiracy theories, that really a lot of community pages are built around and really share this as an identity of looking at truthfulness. All this competing truth claims and the presence of these fake news labels, the well-intended concerns about misinformation may make citizens very uncertain about whom to believe and what factual reality entails. For example, we've seen this around COVID-19, where some people thought it was made in labs, some thought it was a real virus. Also, in terms of the war in Ukraine, some people take into question whether there's really a war and come with alternative factual interpretations of it, to really contribute also to the confusion and relative status of factual knowledge. And also because these concerns are so omnipresent that disinformation is everywhere, people also increasingly blame actual footage of the information as being a deepfake or constructed image that is intentionally constructed to mislead the public. Of course, the imagined communities afforded by social media make a context and platform and can also legitimize these alternative understandings of reality, but also other developments such as an AI that help us to create increasingly more realistic synthetic videos, which can also mean that believing in the affordances of these techniques may make people very untrustworthy towards actual videos and real information. Just because of the technological affordances are seen as capable of making extremely realistic inauthentic content, it can also mean that people perceive real content or real footage as a deepfake. We can also understand this if we look at statistics on the level of trust people have in the written press. On the left-hand side, you can see the positive trust index of different nations, and on the right-hand side, the negative. What's really important here is that we see a skewed distribution that's overall across different countries. People are more likely to have distrust in the press than trust in it. In that sense, it's important to reconceptualize how we perceive mis and disinformation as sort of an individual level idea or a media credibility assessment that moves beyond simple distrust or trust. Hence, we can evaluate media credibility and perceptions of the news media in times of mis and disinformation with similar concepts on the user side or the side of the citizen making sense of his news environment. Here, perceived misinformation refers to the belief that the media or other disseminators of knowledge do not accurately report on reality or deviate from expert knowledge or empirical evidence, however, without the intention to mislead. So really the honest mistakes that can happen in a fast-paced crisis. Then perceived disinformation, which relates to the belief that the media are dishonest, intentionally false, an enemy of the people, and thus deliberately deceiving the public by presenting them with a fake image of social reality. And we see that these concerns or these beliefs about mis and disinformation are actually quite pronounced across many different issues. In this graph, you see that across many different nations, more than half of the population is concerned about mis or disinformation and has concerns whether they can actually accurately detect real or fake news. Of course, there are differences across countries, but it does mean that people are generally very concerned about false information. We also collected original evidence on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we looked at 16 different countries and people's perceptions that different sources would spread false information. And again, we see that there's a very high level of concerns about mis and disinformation. And I think the most worrisome conclusion that can be driven from this is citizens do not really distinguish between levels of mis and disinformation from platforms that are supposed to be more objective and supposed to rely more on factual knowledge, such as the mainstream media platform or the established media platforms in their own countries, versus biased political actors and the NATO. So people don't always distinguish clearly between different actors and perceive in general that there's a high level of this. And these perceptions of mis and disinformation are not without consequences for society. Overall, you could argue that skepticism is not always bad. In democracy, we need to have some kind of critical skills to be able to distinguish between things that are truthful and things that are not true. And we should also be able to resist persuasion and attacks on their beliefs and rely on our critical media skills to really recognize when actors try to deceive or fool us. This is also central to the idea of media literacy, and the importance of detecting deception is that you should have some healthy levels of skepticism and distrust in society in order to make people resilient toward actual misinformation. However, if you look at these very strong concerns that half of the world population is very concerned about mis and disinformation, whereas it is a very a small problem in proportion to factually accurate information, you could also argue that systematic distrust across all the different sources that try to inform us could be a bad thing for democracy. If less than 10% of our media diet is actually false, but most people believe that all information could, in essence, be false, this could also have a very negative impact on media trust and the extent to which people are still able and willing to have trust in factually accurate information. However, if we distinguish between perceptions of misinformation and perceptions of disinformation, we saw that there are some different consequences of these different beliefs. So in some studies, I've found that misinformation beliefs, sort of believing that the media may report on facts inaccurately without the intention to deceive, they actually can have very positive democratic implications, making people more open to cross-cutting views, making people more likely to select established media, and also making people more willing to comply with governmental instructions on COVID-19. However, disinformation beliefs related to non-compliance and avoidance of all media, strong levels of distrust, and sort of a very cynical outlook on society and less openness to conflicting views. We've also seen in other studies that disinformation as a genre or an informational crisis is becoming more persuasive for those who actually distrust established media. So because they sort of tend to perceive that the knowledge being disseminated by the established order is false, they may also be more likely to select actual disinformation that also cultivates this idea that the mainstream media cannot be trusted. However, as a more positive side note here is that people are overall more likely to believe that misinformation on COVID-19 is based on honest mistakes. There's really misinformation, such as a lack of expert knowledge and conflicting evidence, rather than disinformation or really the idea of being deceived intentionally by the media, which is a potentially good side note for democracy and people's critical skills. So it's not all bad, but we should really take into account that disinformation perceptions are not coming too dominant in the sense that they have more negative effects than misinformation beliefs. And if we think that these perceptions are problematic or perhaps even as problematic as disinformation in its own right, we should also take these perceptions into account when coming up with solutions and fighting and combating disinformation. So what should we do? I think in essence, it is crucial that we can maintain a balance between healthy levels of skepticism in the media or critical skills that are helping people to evaluate the trustworthiness of information without overinflating the threats and leading to rejection of the news media and the post-truth world. So it's really about this balance between some skepticism or some misinformation beliefs, but not very strong perceptions of disinformation that could lead to overall avoidance of established knowledge. How can we do this? I think transparency in different levels is really important. We need to take into account that it can be a black box for news users to know how knowledge is being disseminated, how factual knowledge and interpretation are changing over time as a consequence of a dynamic process, and offering transparency in this process of how facts and expert knowledge are being communicated and constructed can help citizens to distinguish between critical literacy skills without making them too distrusting of all media. Related to this, it's really important to have honesty about honest mistakes and acknowledge why and how they occurred. So if you leave open the option that people believe that facts are deliberately kept hidden from them or knowledge is being deliberately manipulated to hide reality from the people, you can also cultivate disinformation beliefs. So therefore, it's really important to stress that there can be mistakes in news coverage, for example, on COVID-19, but these mistakes were driven by a lack of factual knowledge or the process of finding truthfulness or disagreeing expert knowledge really just unmotivated errors that are part of the process of finding information, rather than leaving this open for citizens to see it as disinformation or conspiracy. Therefore, it's also really important to be transparent about what the motives are behind the communication of new information. Was it really about finding facts or neutral interpretation, and not to deceive the public? I think a very general point that is also important is that some of the interventions that we have currently seen that warn us against disinformation or misinformation more generally tend to only focus on the negative side, offering people tips on how to recognize fake news, without really showing people that the threat is relative, that there's also a great majority of information that is factually accurate. And these interventions may also start to focus more on how to restore trust in factually accurate information, alongside warning for the potential. So some main conclusions in our current post-truth world, where fake news accusations and actual disinformation abound, the idea of trust and credibility, cynicism may not fully capture how people perceive news credibility in this new information ecology. In this new information ecology, misinformation beliefs and disinformation beliefs may be more informative, and the distinction between those beliefs in terms of intentions of deception may be relevant to capture the democratic consequences of holding beliefs. And because they have real-life consequences for behaviors, for news seeking, news avoidance, it makes it also important to address these perceptions alongside actually addressing mis and disinformation in its own right. Because overall, you can argue that mis and disinformation perceptions are part of a wider disinformation order, where beliefs about mis and disinformation actually affect selection of mis and disinformation, which make people more distrusting over time and more likely to be trapped in a spiral of disinformation that is deviating further and further from conventional knowledge and factual information. So in a sense, to really end on a positive note, it's important to break through this spiral of cynicism and truth decay with more transparency on the user side and a stronger cultivation of trust in factually accurate information that is actually making up the great majority of all information out there. So thanks a lot for listening. Hope this was a useful outlook on this issue.